Joining me is Senator Ted Cruz. If you happen to be watching us on television, we're at my house and my office in my house. Welcome, Ted. How are you?
Thank you, Glenn. Great to be here.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the idea of stealing the election, because that's what Donald Trump is saying now. And we have him on tape with Santorum talking about how Santorum is not playing the game of the delegate count and, giving him advice on that. And now he's playing dumb like this is being stolen from him.
Look, this is real simple. Donald is a very sore loser. He doesn't handle losing well, and he throws a fit. He is crying and screaming and yelling, and he insults people and he curses at people, and he attacks people when he loses. He behaves like a child, as Anderson Cooper pointed out, like a five-year-old. And the simple reality is in the last 3 weeks, there have been 11 elections in 4 states across the country. And we have beaten Donald Trump in all 11 elections. Donald is panicking. He is scared. Donald loves to call people a loser. Mm-hmm. Donald wakes up at night in cold sweats that people will call him Losin' Donald. That is his ultimate fear, and every time the voters reject him, and they've now done so in 11 elections, starting in Utah, 69% of the voters, we won a landslide there, got every one of the delegates. Then in North Dakota, very different state, they had their convention, they elected their delegates. Of the declared delegates, we won 18, Donald won 1. Then Wisconsin. The media said Wisconsin was a perfect state for Donald Trump. They said Cruz could not win in Wisconsin. It was an upper Midwest state, industrial state, not a very large evangelical population. It was a blue-collar, working-class state. The day before the election, Glenn, Donald boldly predicted a, quote, big victory in Wisconsin. The next day, he didn't specify for whom.
He didn't. He was right.
And the next day, he got shellacked. We won another landslide, 48% of the vote, beat him by 13 points. And then Colorado. The temper tantrum that Donald is throwing over Colorado is really ridiculous, because they didn't just have one election. They had 8 elections in Colorado. They had one in each of the 7 congressional districts. And then they had a statewide convention. I was at the convention. 6,000 people at the convention were packed in there and voted statewide. In the 8 elections, Donald Trump lost all 8. They elected 34 delegates. We won all 34. Now, part of the reason Donald lost is he didn't show up. I went and spoke at the convention. I went and asked the voters for their votes. Donald was supposed to go, but he canceled because he realized he was going to lose, that he didn't have the support in Colorado, so he ran away scared. And now he's just making up nonsense. Do you know how many people voted in the state of Colorado? 65,000 people voted. He's screaming about stealing elections. 65,000 people voted. They just didn't vote for Donald. They voted for our campaign instead, and Donald can't handle it. He's scared. And so his response is just to whine and cry and attack and complain.
The character of a man is seen when they are down, and his character scares me as President of the United States. It really scares me.
Well, he's willing to say things that he knows are false. And he's willing to say things regardless of the consequences.
I want to talk to you, and how much time do we have before the end of the break here? 2 minutes. So when we come back, I want to talk to you about he's willing to say things that he knows are untrue, but he's also willing to dial up the temperature.
Yes.
Yes. And we are a nation on both sides. I mean, 2012, I said the election of 2016 would be 1968, that we would have the summer of rage. And I thought it was going to be in Philadelphia. And you see that Black Lives Matter, George Soros, and everything else, they are putting something together for Philadelphia.
Yep.
But it's going to be possibly worse in Cleveland. And I want to get your thoughts on turning up the temperature of where we are, and how do we put this back together? When yesterday or the day before, the DNC reached out to Hillary and Bernie and said, knock it off. You two are not the enemy. Knock it off. And they both kind of went back. Has anybody said that from the RNC to your campaign, his campaign, any campaign? And should they?
You know, I can't imagine Donald listening to anybody. I've yet to see him listen to anybody in any context ever. Donald is about Donald. And unfortunately, what he's willing to say and what he's willing to do does real damage potentially to the country.
Do you think that he thought when he got into this that he would win? Is this because he's not? He didn't put any infrastructure in. He's fired them all the way along the way. This is not the way to run a campaign.
Who knows? I have no idea. And by the way, that's a pretty remarkable thing to say about someone who's running for president. You have no idea if they think they could win or even if they were serious about it. I think there's a real chance this was a lark. This was, let's get some publicity, let's have some fun. And then I think he was as surprised as anybody.
And now he's now he's bitten by the presidential bug. When we come back, Ted Cruz on the temperature of this race and the fragility of this country. Welcome back to the program. Ted Cruz is joining us in studio, or actually in my house today, as it is. I want to talk to you about the real possibility of violence in Cleveland and even before Cleveland. Let's start in Denver.
Yeah.
They're already starting to give out the home addresses of people that were delegates.
Yes. You know, Glenn, I'm very troubled by this. Donald Trump now has a consistent pattern of inciting violence, of Donald and his henchmen pushing for violence. You know, you go back to his rallies when a protester shows up and Donald tells his supporters, punch the protester in the face. Look, I have protesters. When protesters show up at my events, I actually engage them. Now, if they're disruptive, they're removed. But no politician has the right to threaten violence against American citizens. Even lefty numbskulls are American citizens, and you don't threaten violence against them. You know, you look at Roger Stone, one of Trump's key henchmen. Roger Stone is threatening in Cleveland to put out the hotel rooms of any delegate that dares cross Donald Trump. That is the tactic of union thugs. That is violence. It is oppressive. The idea that Donald is threatening delegates. We're seeing this pattern over and over and over again. And the example you just gave now may be the most troubling. We just had an election in Colorado. We actually had 8 elections in Colorado, 7 in each of the congressional districts, and then a statewide election. 65,000 people voted. And yet Donald Trump's campaign put out publicly, his supporters, the phone number of the state chairman. He's received over 3,000 calls and death threats. Donald needs to understand he's not Michael Corleone. I understand that Donald has had some very shady business deals with people that are currently in prison, mobsters. But the presidency should not be La Cosa Nostra. And it is wrong for a presidential candidate or for his henchmen. You know, Donald keeps hiring people with records of dirty tricks, of lies, and of threats to violence. And, you know, we have an opportunity right now to unite this country, to bring this country together, to defeat Hillary Clinton, and to turn the country around. You and I both understand the country is at the edge of a cliff. We're bankrupting this nation. Our Constitution is dangling by a thread. And Donald is spending his time dividing us and inciting violence. That is wrong. And, you know, when Donald has rallies where he demands of every person there, raise your hand and pledge allegiance to me, Donald Trump. This is the United States of America. We don't pledge allegiance to a man. We pledge allegiance to a flag. We take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. But Donald needs to stop threatening the voters. He needs to stop threatening the delegates. He is not a mobster.
How do you think that is going to play with the delegates? Because if I were the average person and I heard they're going to give out my hotel room, or I'm getting death threats now, some will say, I'm just going to shut up. I wasn't in for this. But I think the majority will push the other direction.
Well, look, I think that's right. I think the people who run for delegate are patriots. They're people who love this country. They're people who are scared for their kids and grandkids. And the important thing to understand is Donald is not strong. Donald is weak. Bullies, by their nature, are weak. Donald loves attacking women because, I guess, it makes him feel strong to attack women. When Donald began attacking my wife, I think it made him feel strong. Now, the good thing is Heidi is not threatened by bullies. She's been in the business world a long time.
Yeah.
And this bellowing bully, Heidi just laughs him off, and Donald doesn't know what to do. And these threats, listen, I think Donald has been surrounded by sycophants his entire business career. He was born into great wealth and privilege. His father was a real estate baron. At every stage, Donald, when he told a joke, everyone in the room laughed. Whether it was funny or not, you had to laugh. I mean, look at the humiliation he inflicts on people like Chris Christie. Chris Christie is a good man. I like Chris Christie. Chris Christie right now is trapped in his own private hell. When Chris was standing behind Donald Trump holding his jacket, the look in his eyes, you could see the screaming.
Oh, yeah.
And you know what actually gets me? Is the servility of Chris forced to call Donald Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump. You notice everyone, once they get sucked into that orbit, they have to call him Mr. Trump. Chris Christie is the governor of New York. Chris Christie called him Donald until the day Donald demanded, "You may never again call me Donald. Nobody calls me Donald."
So let me take you back to the convention. You know what you just said is true. I know what you just said is true. I know how the delegate system works. Mm-hmm. This is why, before Donald Trump ever got in, I looked at my own staff after talking to you, and I came back to my own staff and I said it on the radio. You don't know this guy's ground game. I talked to him about his ground game. Forget about whatever you're thinking. The ground game is how you win, and Ted Cruz's ground game is solid. That's now starting to pay off, and now you're starting to see this. But Donald is taking this and is taking all of the lies. Really, Cass Sunstein. I mean, you could take what Cass Sunstein said to do to the right. He has done it. He's flipped us upside down. Right. He's torn us apart. And how are we going to go to a convention where your delegates are not going to vote for him, his delegates are not going to vote for you, and whoever wins, a third or half, walk away saying, no way?
Well, I think it's very simple. The odds are now very high that we go to a contested convention. Donald, it is almost impossible for Donald to get to 1,237 delegates. You know, the fact that he has now lost 11 elections in a row in the last 3 weeks, these 3 weeks have determined that Donald can't get to 1,237.
Right.
When we get to a contested convention, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to have a ton of delegates. Donald's going to have a ton of delegates. And it's going to be a battle then to see who can earn a majority. And Glenn, in Cleveland, I believe we will have an enormous advantage. One of the ways to understand it is the simple question, where do the Rubio and Kasich delegates go?
Right.
And I think they naturally come to us. They're not going to go to Donald, particularly when he is threatening violence and abusing the system. And the amazing thing, you know, there's a lot of focus on our ground game, and I'm proud of the job our team has done organizing. But it's important to understand, our staffers couldn't do this if there was not a grassroots tsunami. Mm-hmm. The energy and passion. You've been on the road. Mm-hmm. You've seen, I mean, the power. You know, people ask me, is it tiring running for president? And the answer is yes. You're going 18 hours a day, 6-7 days a week. I'm in one city, my dad's in another city, my wife's in another city. We're going relentlessly, but I am inspired because
it's exhilarating. The people are exhilarating.
When you see little old ladies who hug you and cry, when you see the other day in Wisconsin, a little boy, he's probably about 7 years old, took out his wallet and gave me $1.37 and a Metro card. Everything, he emptied his wallet. He was giving back each penny, counting them out.
That is so amazing.
That's what, I remember a woman in South Carolina who was paralyzed. And she was in a wheelchair and she could barely move. She was almost entirely paralyzed. And I remember her just hugging me with tears, and she couldn't say anything, and yet her eyes and the hugs, what I heard, what I believe she was communicating was, we've got to save our country. That is the reason we're winning these campaigns. The reason in Colorado we won 8 elections is because we are seeing little old ladies, we're seeing young people and college students, we're seeing libertarians, we're seeing pastors, we're seeing people who love this country coming out, and they're crawling over broken glass. It's not for me. It's not about me. It's about the country. It's about the Constitution. And so our vaunted ground game, we're doing a good job. I agree with that. But basically what we're doing is logistics. We've got people saying, I will do anything I can. What can we do? And we tell them, okay, the election's on this date at this location, go here. So it's, we're trying to organize it, but it is coming from the people. And that is what's giving it the strength.
So let me, because I'm running out of time, unfortunately, let me change here, because you just said Donald's had a very bad few weeks.
Yes.
He's about to go in, the media is expecting 2, 3 or 4 very good weeks. And I warned the audience yesterday.
Yeah.
Cruz people feel good, Donald Trump people feel bad right now.
Yeah.
But that's about to flip.
Yep.
Because this is a long haul, and he's going into favorable conditions. What do you see happening in the next 3 weeks, and what should we expect so you don't feel beaten down?
Well, look, Donald may well have a good about 2 weeks. New York State is coming up. New York is his home state. He ought to be able to win his home state. He ought to win his home state convincingly. If Donald isn't substantially above 50% in New York, it will be a big loss for him. But you would expect him to win his home state. In Texas, when he came down to Texas, we walloped Donald Trump here in Texas. And so you would expect him to do well in New York. We're competing in New York. We hope to pick up some delegates. I was in the Bronx. I was in Brooklyn. We're headed to New York this week. We're competing there. Heidi's in New York right now campaigning, but it's his home state. He's likely to do well in New York. And then there are a series of states in the Northeast where some of the polling numbers suggest he's in a strong position. Now, I'll tell you, there are states like Pennsylvania, states like Maryland, where we've got tremendous support. Pennsylvania, just a couple of weeks ago, they had a statewide political conference. They had a straw poll. We won with 65% of the vote. We've got incredible support on the ground in Pennsylvania, incredible support on the ground in Maryland. We're going to fight in those states. But Donald could have a good couple of weeks. He could get a pretty decent chunk of delegates, but then we're going to shift into states that are much more favorable, states like Indiana, states like Nebraska, states like South Dakota, states like Montana. And then the whole race is going to come down to California. 172 delegates.
How are you doing in California?
We're doing fantastic.
How's the ground game? So
I was in California yesterday. We had huge rallies in Orange County and San Diego. Both of them sold out within the first 24 hours with thousands of people on the waiting lists. The energy we got there, we have announced 119 people on our leadership team. We announced yesterday 50 current and former elected officials in California who have endorsed the campaign. We have over 11,000 volunteers in California. And I'll tell you something interesting. 538.
Yeah.
It's the website it was the numbers guys of the New York Times.
Yep.
Now, they're liberals.
Yeah,
they're Democrats. They're no friends of mine.
No, Barack Obama guys.
But they're very good at what they do.
Oh, yeah.
They know the numbers well.
Yeah.
538 currently has the odds of the Cruz campaign winning California at 61%, roughly 2-1 over Donald Trump. And that's because the support we've got on the ground. And Donald's ground game is non-existent. So if and when the people of California vote against Donald Trump, he's going to scream that they're stealing the election. Apparently, whenever anyone votes against him, it's an act of theft.
I've got to take a break, and it's a network break. So tell real quick just the story of Washington State. Just tell that real quick.
Well, this weekend, Washington State selected their delegates, and they select their delegates. They're going to vote in the weeks coming up. But apparently the Trump campaign had no idea even that Washington State was electing their delegates. And a couple of days beforehand, in a panic, they sent out an email, this new fellow that he's recruited, to the guru of delegates, sent out an email in a panic to Trump's Washington supporters, come and vote for the delegates. But they messed up. They sent the email to Trump's Washington, D.C. supporters instead of the supporters in the state of Washington.
So that's something that I mean, when you hear that and then you hear they're stealing the election, it is mass incompetence, to the level where you think he's not serious.
Donald's whole pitch is he's a great businessman, and yet his campaign right now, it appears he can't run a lemonade stand. And let me ask you something, Glenn. You ever watch his TV show, The Apprentice?
No.
I watched it a few times. Good. It was kind of fun, and he would bring in apprentices, and they'd get a job.
Right.
And if they did it badly, he was withering. I'll tell you this, if Donald were an apprentice on his show, looking at their inability to even show up and win elections, Donald would say to himself, "You're fired."